everybody. My name is Diana, and I'm a proud member of the Unfinished community. And I will be your host for the next two guest speakers. Coming up on the stage now, we have Jerry Michalski. And it's really interesting the fact that Jerry has been writing about technology when not so many people were doing so. He has been writing newsletters when that was really not something mainstream. And I'm happy that I had the chance to actually work with Jerry in a professional setting. And I remember at that time learning about his purpose, which is to create this collective memory of our society. So imagine that how he does that is using his own brain, he's creating a digital brain. And he's allowing all of us to enter into that. So you can all go into jerrysbrain.com, and you can see all the information he has gathered there. I think there are more than 1 million links and information put together, with this big aim of creating a collective memory for all of us. And I think we all need more education into building things that are collective and building things that are a legacy. Because there are a lot of information on the internet that maybe separates us towards a certain bubble or another one. Or there are some things on the internet that we don't want to forget about. So through the Jerry's brain, we can have a proof of what happened in the last 25 years. So coming up next on the stage, you have Jerry Michalski, sharing a very interesting worldview. And again, you can feel free to dig more into the Jerry's brain. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. That's it's really lovely to be here in person. I was participating in Unfinished 2020. That was the first one I was at, which I loved, but it was virtual. And then last year I did story threading through the event. I story threaded 6 different sessions. And this year I'm actually here in person, and it's very different and really beautiful. Unfinished is a labor of love and trust. And I really felt that the moment a couple days ago before the campus that we're on looked like the campus. Everything was being built. And I walked in and I saw a guy in overalls, and it was Christian. And he came up and he gave me this gigantic warm hug. And I thought, okay, this is like, I'm here. It's fabulous. And then I met Makul, and then I met a whole bunch of really cool people, and the whole thing got off to a fantastic start. So I'm very happy to be here to share with you how I came about the ideas that I talked about in 2020. That's kind of the plot of what I'm going to talk about here. Now, I'm going to present a worldview, but I'm an amateur. I'm not a sociologist, an anthropologist, a psychologist, a lawyer, luckily, sort of none of those things. And I'm just going to tell you a point of view that emerged for me over the last 30 years, partly with the goal of explaining how you might find a worldview that works for you. But this is just one point of view on the world. You may disagree with parts of it. That's awesome. One of the jobs or one of the roles of a good point of view is to be something you can push against, something you can question, something that helps you question your own assumptions. So that's my goal here. And I think I've come up with a worldview around trust that is realistic and optimistic and practical. And I built this, the reason for the title of this talk is I built this worldview by recognizing over time that some people who were my heroes were contrarians. They were kind of outsiders in their fields. They were pushed out. What they were saying was heretical to their colleagues. And they were off-center. They were not in the mainstream of their particular disciplines, whether it's transportation planning or software or education or what have you. And you'll see I have a whole pantheon of these heroes, and I started to detect patterns there. So you will get a link to this deck. In fact, if you go to jerrymichalski.com, which is one of my sites, if you go to jerrymichalski.com/now, you will find a link to this deck right this moment, what I'm about to present to you. And at the end of the deck, I put a whole bunch of other links that go to some of the things I'm going to mention. So you'll be able to tour around through all the materials. And I would love to get emails from you or whatever else. In yesterday's email, oops, there we go. In yesterday's email, as I'm sitting over breakfast, I had a couple of emails that were just resonant with the theme I'm about to present. One of them was this from the Chan Zuckerberg Initiative, talking about how open source software has really affected science, but nobody's studied it and nobody credits open source software. But they were saying that the availability of open source software and open data and all that is transforming science. And I thought that was kind of cool. And then there was an article from the Washington Post about how thousands were released from prison during COVID, and the results are shocking. And let me just read this for a second. We are keeping many people in prison, even though there are no danger to the public, a jaw-dropping new statistic shows. That serves as proof that it's time to rethink our incarceration policies for those with a low risk of offending. And it goes on to say, of the 11,000 people who were eventually released during the pandemic, 11 of them committed new crimes. And then it says, 17. And it says, that's not a typo, 17. This is the U.S. has a really bad incarceration problem, and that's about trust. And I thought, I'm really happy to be here to talk about this topic. And what I'm not going to go further than I went in 2020. I'm going to try to explain how I got to what I said in 2020. And to do that, I want to start by recapping the speech I did back then. And so it went roughly like this. We're in the middle of 5 crises, 4 crises, 6 crises. You may count your crises differently, but 2020 was the middle of the pandemic, so that was one of my crises. But there's certainly anthropogenic climate change. There's a bunch of other problems out there. But worse, our social contract is broken. All the protests that are out there, the Gilets Jaunes, Occupy, Arab Spring, Cacerolazos in South America, all these different protests are people who are saying, my children's future looks worse than the present and that my future looked at their age. This is intolerable. So how do we fix this? How do we actually create a better future for everybody? So I think there's a general unwilling renegotiation of the social contract around the world, and different people are proposing different ways forward. And I call our current situation meltdown, because things were looking pretty grim in 2020. And so some of the paths out of meltdown are, don't worry, this will all work out. Let's just preserve the status quo. Man, just from looking at sort of the climate events that are happening in the last couple months, I think the status quo is a series of escalating disasters. I'm not happy about the status quo. There's a bunch of people called the new optimists that say, hey, look at the statistics. Things are much better than they used to be. Fewer people, fewer mothers die after childbirth, hunger, other sorts of numbers. China raised 200 million people out of poverty. That's great. And I'm like, yeah, but the world is still really broken and the social contract is still broken. That doesn't really work for me. There's a few people who are techno-utopians. And they're like, oh, don't worry, technology will fix it. We will put a Dyson sphere in the sky that will reflect away the sunshine and fix the climate problem. Or we'll drop iron filings in the ocean and that'll fix it. I don't know. I sort of don't buy that technology is going to fix this. And I would add a couple things to my presentation from 2020, because in the interim, Mark Zuckerberg renamed Facebook to Meta, and he's talking about the metaverse. And in his presentation explaining the metaverse, what he presents would have sort of been embarrassing in the year 2000. It was not interesting. And I'm not up for wearing goggles all the time and walking around in a 3D simulated sphere so that I can buy the scarf that the lady walking by virtually just is wearing. That's like not a world that sounds appealing. If anything, it sounds a little dystopian. And then right next door, sort of next door, but in the same moment, there's a bunch of people talking about crypto and blockchain and Bitcoin, and there's a crypto utopian future as well, in which distributed, decentralized autonomous organizations have markets and people vote with their cryptocurrency. This also sounds kind of dystopian to me. But I think that the piece parts of what we're going to be using down the road are available, but these futures don't sound great to me. And then Doug Rushkoff just published recently a book, I forget its title, but basically he met a bunch of billionaires who invited him to speak, and he figured out that, oh my God, they're asking me, how do we survive these crises? How do we get safely out of here? And one of the answers is spaceships. We have to get off this rock because we've broken this rock already. This rock is too broken to fix. Let's get ourselves into space. And my tongue-in-cheek answer to this is, I've read too much good science fiction to want to be on any of the first 1,000 spaceships off this rock. Like that does not end well. I can give you some names of books to read if you want. So I'm a realist. And even though right now there are actors who are very intelligent, who are very intentionally undermining our trust in facts, in journalism, in science, in elections, in each other, and this is working, I actually think trust is the way out. So what I want to do for the next remainder of the hour, and leave some time for Q&A, so start thinking about questions you'd like to ask, is say, how on earth did I get to this weird, optimistic, realistic place? So this presentation is kind of the backstory of that. And here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to present an itch, one thing that started bothering me in the mid-90s. Then I'm going to tell you stories about 5 of my contrarians, my off-center people. All of that goes into a blender funnel machine device. And out of that, I begin to notice patterns. And I'll describe those patterns. That turns into some conclusions that I started drawing from the patterns. And I can play that forward as a policy platform. And then I'll go meta along the way and talk about the process and also what lessons did I learn from it. And as I said, there's a slide at the end that has resources and links for you. But this is kind of the path I want to take. I can pretty much pinpoint the itch. So the itch is the word consumer, and it started itching in the year 1993. It started itching at a lunch meeting with the new CEO of Women.com. Her name was Marlene McDaniel. She had been hired by the founder of Women.com, Ellen Pack, who I knew, who was a lovely person, good feminist, really interesting, but probably her funders didn't think she was going to run this company to become a major enterprise. So they hired an executive, a senior woman named Marlene McDaniel. And I came to this meeting extremely excited. I was like, there are so many issues that women need to face, from the glass ceiling to misogyny to violence against against women and girls to, you could easily just go through a whole agenda. I was sitting down to the new CEO of Women.com on the freshly minted World Wide Web, thinking this is going to be awesome. And within the first couple minutes, and she's not lying to me at all, she's truth in advertising, she says, my job is to sell women to advertisers. She says that out loud. And she's not lying. She's being completely honest. She was hired from Madison Avenue. She was an ad executive, now to run Women.com. And I felt my heart break a little bit, because I was like, how do I be a good ally? There's going to be a great possibility here. And I thought, wow, like we've consumerized Women.com and what we do for women. And it's going to be like a magazine. It's going to be like Vogue, Bazaar, Cosmopolitan. We're going to sell ads to sell stuff to women. And in the meantime, there's just so much to fix, right? So my heart broke a little bit back then when I saw the word consumer, and that's the itch. Now that happens and gets thrown into the funnel, and along the way, I've got a bunch of contrarians, and I don't mean a contrarian, the second definition here is an investor who buys shares of stock when most others are selling. I don't mean that one. I just mean the first one, someone who takes a contrary position or attitude. And I'll refine this definition a little bit. Here's a collection of some of my contrarians. John Taylor Gatto, Alice Miller, Daryl Davis, Masanobu Fukuoka, Mohammed Yunus, Joost de Blok, Hans Monderman, Buck Brannaman. These are all people. I'll tell you stories about 5 of these people because we only have sort of 50 minutes together. You can find all of them in my brain. I have, of course, the thought contrarians who make or made sense. And here are all of them plus a bunch more. And you can actually click on any one of them and then see each of their contexts and explore to your heart's content. I can't see your hands, but call out if you know who Harrison Owen is. One voice said yes. That was good. So Harrison Owen is the creator of something. It's a group facilitation process. His field, his domain, is events, meetings, when humans get together to do stuff, conferences, things like that. And he produced a scientific conference back in the late 80s, I think, where he worked really hard for a year, and he booked speakers, and he had a keynote speech and a capstone speech and panels and white paper sessions, and it was a scientific conference. And when the conference was over, he realized that the best part of the conference was the coffee breaks and the lunches and the hallway walks and everybody getting to and from the conference and the problems that came up that was all the best part of the conference. So he had kind of a moment of sadness that he had worked so hard on the substance of the meeting, and yet the interesting parts were the breaks. And so he tried to invert the whole thing and turn he created a process called open space, where he said, why don't we let people structure the events? And his heresy is, why don't we trust the participants in a particular event to tell us what we should talk about? It's really interesting. And so I met him in person. Some of my heroes I actually got to meet. I met him in person summer of 92 when I took a workshop about open space in Bar Harbor, Maine. There's a couple side stories to it, but it was really, really interesting. So I'm a trained open space facilitator. And what you do in open space is you create a focus for the event when you send out invites. You mind the space in a way, and you introduce the process in a way that creates safety. Safety is really important because the next thing you're going to do is you're going to invite people who are right here, who might be colleagues but might be strangers. You're going to invite them into the center to write down on a big sheet of paper and a big fat marker a short description of a topic that they think all of us should talk about. And then they speak it out to the whole group, and they put this topic on a wall where there's a schedule, and they say, let's talk about this at 2 o'clock in room B. And then everybody around in the open space makes up their mind which one of the sessions they want to go to. Sometimes they come back and they switch sessions every day, and you can have an open space for a couple hours, a little awkward, all the way to 3 days is sort of the longest open space I've seen. My friend Kalia Hamlin actually has been running an open space workshop for 7 or 8 years called the Internet Identity Workshops. And out of that have come a whole bunch of internet startups, identity startups and privacy startups and so forth. So you invite people to jump in, and then you let them go. You teach them a couple ground rules. There's something called the law of 2 feet, which says if you're sitting in one of the sessions and for some reason it doesn't feel right, it's not what you expected, or maybe it wasn't what you expected, but it's really not working, feel free with no excuses to get up and move to a different session. So you give people permission to move where they think their energy and interests are best used in the meeting. Kind of cool. I've been to a bunch of these now, but boy, it's sort of startling. The first time you participate in one of these things, you hear the process explained, you're like, surely this isn't going to work. There's going to be crickets and nobody's going to walk in and use their magic marker and write anything, right? And then they do. And they always do. And then it works. And it's kind of magical, but the key here is trust. That's the linchpin. So also I was influenced by Quaker meeting. There's this religious society of friends known as the Quakers have a process for how they get together and do things. And also David Bohm, the physicist, had a process he called Bohm Dialogue. There's a bunch of things like this that are very self-organizing that trust participants. So that's Harrison Owen. Say yes if you know who Hans Monderman is. No, okay. And don't feel bad, because the fact that these people are not familiar is kind of proving my point that trust is deprecated. We sort of push it aside, we ignore it. A lot of my heroes were pushed aside in their disciplines. So Hans Monderman is in the field of urban design and transportation planning. I got to meet him in 2006. His Wikipedia picture, which I have here, is a picture I took. So my photograph is on Wikipedia. And occasionally I'll get an email that says, I also posted some videos back then to YouTube of him walking and explaining what was happening in Drachten, a little town in the Netherlands, which he had helped redesign a lot of streets and intersections in. And so I occasionally get requests to use those materials in a documentary or something else. But his heresy is, all those traffic signs and all the affordances that we put and paint and put around intersections and streets to try to make things safer, make things less safe. It's weird. It's counterintuitive. He said, look, why don't we design streets and intersections carefully and then trust people to make eye contact through the intersections, and then when you match pace with somebody, you make your way through. It works just fine. So roundabouts happen a lot. He didn't necessarily love roundabouts. But traffic calm, what this is called is traffic calming or shared spaces. And what happens is injury rates go down. In fact, again, traffic-calmed intersections look a little bit dangerous and confusing, which means drivers naturally slow down. But they don't have to come to a stop. Like, you don't have a situation in any place where Hans has touched, half the people aren't sitting waiting at a red light, waiting for things to happen while their engine burns, carbon products. So what happens is when you do this, the injury rate actually goes down, throughput stays high, but it seems very counterintuitive. It's like, how could safety measures not work? What it does also is it treats people not just as drivers versus pedestrians and bicyclists, but it treats them as citizens in the same shared space. That's why the name shared spaces has sort of come up in this way. He had a really interesting method of propagating the idea, and mostly across Holland, although this movement picked up in Australia and England, and now it's happening all over the world in little places. But his method was, he would go to a new town, and he would never go to the traffic department or the transportation people, because the transportation people in Holland know exactly what you do to do an intersection, because the EU has mandated you use this color paint, this many centimeters from the sidewalk, you do this and this, the lights should be this this model light. Everything is standardized and predicted, and he's trying to undo that. So he would go to other people who were in charge of planning for the city, and he would approach them and explain the process, and then give them a tour, a walking tour and a driving tour of other towns where this had already happened. And then, and I find this really fascinating, he would go away for 3 or 4 months, because he knew that this counterintuitive idea had to gestate. It had to sit with people, and it had to sink in, and they had to talk to their family. They had to go drive the town themselves. They had to talk amongst themselves. And then he'd come back and check in with them and say, well, what do you think? And very often they'd be like, we're done, we're convinced. And then they would sit down for some very careful planning, because like these other things based on trust, they take thoughtful design. You really have to sort of redesign streets and intersections, thinking about how they read to a driver and a pedestrian and everybody else. But I love this movement, and I've been a big fan. Tell me if you've heard of Eleanor Ostrom. Yay! Okay, so we have like 3 yeses. This is good. This is like 1,000% better than we were doing before. So Lynn Ostrom was a political scientist working in economics. Her heresy is, there's a famous essay written by a soil biologist named Garrett Hardin titled The Tragedy of the Commons, in which this fellow writes about how commons don't exist because everybody always takes advantage of them, so there can't really be any commons. And it turns out he was kind of ignorant, and this was a really bad essay, and this essay stamped a whole bunch of people's brains with the idea that commons are impossible. So tragedy of the commons is sort of a meme out there that she was trying to get rid of by coming up with principles for managing commons. And a lot of her work started in places like the American Northeast with lobster fisheries. So she was trying to make sure that Maine lobster fishermen didn't overfish their lobsters. So how do you create boundaries and sanctions? And my next slide will show you the 8 principles for managing commons. And I'm not going to stop on it because you'll see it's a lot of text, but you can find it online. But she came up with a whole series of things that help us manage commons together. Now, I've been saying this each time, right? This takes thoughtful design. You have to sit down and think about what the rules are, what the boundaries are, how this all works. She did win the 2009 Nobel Prize for Economics for this work, despite not being an economist. I find that really interesting. Here are the 8 principles of managing commons that Ostrom puts in front of us. Clearly defined boundaries, rules concerning appropriation, collective choice arrangements, et cetera, et cetera. Who has heard of John Taylor Gatto? Oh, it's crickets. Wow. Nobody? Okay. He's one of my heroes. This is another person that I met. I never got to meet Lynn Ostrom, but I met John Taylor Gatto several times. He was on a panel for me. He was a retired New York high school teacher who wrote a bunch of books that are really interesting, but I learned about him when my friend Doc Searles sent me an essay that he wrote for a magazine called The Sun, and the title of that essay was The 6 Lessons School Teacher. So he's in education. His heresy is, hey, guess what? Kids are boring curious. They're dying to learn. They're little learning machines. Why don't we trust them? Because we've built an institution called compulsory education that doesn't seem to trust kids, if you think about it for a little while. And I've done one TEDx talk in 2012, and it's called What If We Trusted You? And it's only about education, even though I'm neither a parent nor a teacher. But I'm fascinated by how we learn, and I'm extra fascinated by the institutions we've created to try to make people learn, when in fact, people are little learning machines and born that way. So his heresy is trust kids. The thing that sort of gets the label that gets put on some of his work is unschooling or deschooling. It's also called self-directed education. A couple of the names. I really don't like the name unschooling because it's an un-thing. It's a not thing. So schooling bad, not schooling, don't know. But I love the concept. The concept is very much about liberating kids to go figure out what they need to do. And one of the things he told me was, learning basic reading and basic math is not very hard. He says the average child can learn basic reading or basic math in about 100 hours of applied time. There's only one variable that matters. The child has to want to. That's it. And guess what? They don't all want to in March of their 12th year of life or whatever it is, because we have the whole system set up like a metronome where we put kids into age-separated grades, which I don't understand at all. Like, you've immediately cut abundance out of the equation, because it used to be we had, at least in the US, we had one-room schoolhouses all across the country. And so Sally would teach Bobby his numbers while over there, Victoria and Jim were doing something different. And that worked really well, because the best way to learn things is often to teach it to somebody who's just a couple steps behind you. And you lose that when you just make sure that the grades never talk to each other, never touch each other. The sixth graders, they don't really want to deal with the fifth graders, right? Fifth graders are uncool. Where in fact, teaching something to a younger person is one of the coolest things you can possibly do. So what's the deal, right? So I love Gatto, and he's pretty radical out there about education. I went through the compulsory education system, normal schools. I turned out, I think, okay. Most of you sitting there probably just said that to yourselves. But once you start thinking about education and seeing what he was discovering, in particular the hidden curriculum of school, you'll be like, oh yeah, damn it. That's right. And my next slide is the hidden curriculum of school, but I want to describe things a little bit more first. I recommend reading his book, The Underground History of American Education. One of the good stories he tells in The Underground History is American educators like Horace Mann and a couple other people went to Germany, Prussia at the time, and they basically saw the military schooling system that had been built for Bismarck. And they imported that and dropped it on America. And in America, at the time, when they did the first few tests in Manhattan, there were riots in the streets, and mounted police hurt families and children. The people were like, no, don't do this to us. And then they rolled it out slowly across pretty much all the schools in the country, and we industrialized education. So around the US Civil War is kind of the beginning of that through the First World War. So The Underground History of American Education has many things like it. And I was in a conversation earlier today where I described another story he tells. He loves collecting stories of young people who did really incredible things. And one of his heroes is David Farragut, who was the first admiral of the US Navy. And I used to tell this story a little bit. I would say that at age 12, Farragut was put on board a warship, a British warship, as a midshipman with status or authority over the regular able-bodied seamen. And then after saying this a couple times, I was like, I better fact check myself. So I went and looked it up, and I was wrong. Farragut was put on board a British warship at age 9 as a midshipman. And at age 12, he had his first command of a ship briefly, because his captain had taken a prize, another ship, prisoner, and that ship had to be sailed back to port to collect. You should read up on the age of sail. It's fascinating. That ship had to be sailed back to port, and so he puts Farragut on board and says, you, take it back to port. The captured captain says, I'm not being taken anywhere by a 12-year-old. Farragut says, if he shows his face above decks, have him shot. And the rest is American history. So what I'm trying to say is not that we should press all children into service in the military at 9. What I'm trying to say is that young people are way more capable than we think they are. They like hard fun. They like difficult things. They like to make their world better. And instead, what we do is we scoop them out of the real world. We drop them into a petri dish called school, and we say, here, perform against these metrics. So here's some the hidden curriculum of school isn't sort of a canon like the principles for governing a commons. It's more a big grab bag of ideas. But from the 6th lesson school teacher, he says things like, in the classroom, I, your teacher, I am God. What I say goes. I can put a mark on your record that'll stay with you for life, stain your ability to get a good marriage, everything else. Stay still, or I'll make you a troublemaker and put another stain on your record. You're here sort of learning, and these are all things. What's interesting about the hidden curriculum, the reason it's called the hidden curriculum, is that we don't say these things ever out loud. We say we're teaching you mathematics, we're teaching you languages, we're teaching you history, whatever, but we don't say we're teaching you to surrender your will to a predestined chain of command. At least I didn't see that in the brochures. But that's what's happening, because the structure of the compulsory system, you're being surveilled, you're being watched in school. In the US, after Columbine, the shootings in Columbine, schools installed video cameras everywhere. The kids are, in fact, actively being surveilled and can't be left alone anywhere by themselves. So that's the hidden curriculum of school. And I kind of generalized out from that and started thinking about the hidden architectures of mistrust in every system, because this is those hidden architectures in schooling. So who's heard of Christopher Alexander? This is like 10x the response. I love that. So CA, Christopher Alexander, I've never shaken his hand, but I've been in a lecture of his at Berkeley. He lives in Berkeley and is a retired teacher. I think he might have died, though. Pretty sure he's dead now. Forgot to check before the talk. Sorry about that. And his field is architecture and urban design, so design of buildings and also urban spaces and so forth. And his heresy is, hey, occupants, the people who are going to be in those buildings, ought to participate in the design of those buildings and those spaces. And architects are like, no, this is for experts. You've got to have a degree and do whatever else. And he's like, nonsense. So he and a bunch of colleagues in the early 80s invent something called pattern languages. And a pattern language is a sequence of patterns that form up into a language to describe the distilled wisdom of that domain. And I'll give you an example in just a moment. But pattern languages are not rules. They're not, you must do this, you have to do this, always do this. They're just like, hey, if you want to create a living space that feels inviting, do this instead of that. And they work. They're really, really interesting. Again, there's a theme here. This takes thoughtful design. So when you learn what a pattern language is and how it works, you start to apply this in a thoughtful way. My favorite pattern, which I'll show you on the next page, is light on two sides. And this pattern language movement, here's a picture of the book, the famous book called A Pattern Language, that was published back in the early 80s, actually 1977, I think. I've met a couple of architects who said, oh, I love Christopher Alexander. My way of working with a new client is I hand them a copy of his book and I say, leaf through this. If you like this, we can work together. And I think that's really, really interesting, right? So the pattern language movement has spawned a bunch of other pattern languages. So I am friends with people who've created a pattern language for facilitating meetings, a pattern language for digital literacy and crap detection online, a pattern language for wise democracy. There's a fellow named Tom Atlee with a bunch of his colleagues created the wise democracy pattern language. You can Google it. It's fabulous. And so these are all people distilling wisdom from their domains and making it available to everybody else, but nobody knows about them. They're all hidden away, and part of my mission in life right now is to make them more available and more useful. So here's pattern number 159 of 253 patterns in that book. It's called Light on Two Sides of Every Room, and it says, when they have a choice, people will always gravitate to those rooms which have light on two sides and leave the rooms which are lit only from one side unused and empty. And so the next time you walk into a New York restaurant that's long and narrow and has only windows to the street, even though it's beautifully decorated inside, if it's daylight, there's a little piece of you that might be going, gosh, why does this not feel so welcoming? And there's another piece that'll be, that's because it violates light from two sides, right? So what's interesting about a well-written pattern language is that each pattern is sort of memorable. And so muggles, ordinary people, can actually participate at a much higher level than before, because they'll be like, oh, let's move the room over here. Well, we could do that, except that would violate light from two sides. And the 253 patterns range from, the first patterns are about urban planning and land use. And the last pattern is make special niches just for children. And so they kind of intersect, and there's dependencies between them. So one of the patterns might say, this one touches these 5 patterns, et cetera, et cetera. It's like a little hypertexty kind of thing. But I think pattern languages are a general purpose way of communicating wisdom to make people smarter in anything. So these are the contrarian inspirations that I just talked about. These are the fields that each of them operates in, and I haven't talked about all of them. One of them is Buck Brannaman, who does horse gentling. And these are the insights that each of them brought to the world. Now, Buck Brannaman is not the first horse gentler. He comes from a sort of a lineage of them. But there's a documentary titled Buck, which you can watch online. But there's a 2.5-minute trailer to the documentary, which I played once for a workshop I ran. And we spent the entire afternoon talking about this 2.5-minute trailer. Because I went up and I played the first sentence in the trailer, which was, gosh, when he does what he does, it looks like voodoo. And then I hit pause. Because instead of breaking horses, which is what we think we normally have to do, when you want to ride a horse, you have to break its will so you can put a saddle on it and then a rider on it. You join up with horses in horse gentling. You form a bond of trust. And for somebody who's always been raised to think you have to break horses, the first time you hear that, you're like, wow, that's nuts. And then once you see it happen and once you figure out what's going on, you think, wow, why haven't we been doing that always? Right? It's very interesting because horses were brought to the Americas from Europe and Asia. They weren't native to the Americas. And then some horses get loose and start multiplying. So down in Patagonia, horses were found by the locals, by indigenous tribes, and they didn't know from horses or what to do about them. So there's a practice like horse gentling called Doma India, which is its own natively developed, indigenously developed way of joining up with horses. So these are my contrarians, and a question that's probably bubbling in your head is like, okay, great, but how do you tell the difference between here's to the crazy ones? This is the text of the Apple ad, the famous Apple ad that shows Picasso and Georgia O'Keeffe and a bunch of geniuses. How do you separate those from the tin hat crazies, right? And if you were in the session with Mario and yesterday and me yesterday, I'll just bring in Alex Jones wearing a tin hat because he's an attention monster, and he's got stories to tell that a lot of people believe in. So how do you distinguish between a contrarian, and he's definitely a contrarian, I'll say that for him, but I would recommend you not trust what he says. And there's a lot of money right now that's betting on my side of this bet, because he's losing some damage lawsuits in the United States to a point where it'll probably break him. So one answer to this question, and this is actually a hard question, and I think each of us needs to develop our own sort of sense of our own moral compass and our own sense of orientation around this. But one answer I have to this is the difference between being defenseless and being undefended. So if you're defenseless and somebody comes up and it has bad intentions, you will likely get hurt. But if you know how to defend yourself, but you put your hands down, they say that handshakes or waving are to show that you're not holding a weapon and to build a connection of trust. Probably true. But if you're undefended, it means that you're able to defend yourself, but you're putting down your guard a little bit. And that's an opening of vulnerability, and that's an invitation for trust. So what I mean in relation to how do you detect from the crazies and the good contrarians is, you need to know how to defend yourself. You need some literacies and some opinions about what the world looks like and how it works. That will help you filter the crazies from the not-so-crazies. So now I want to go meta on the whole process and just talk about how, those were my 5 contrarians out of, as I showed you, a whole bushel of them. And what happened was, for each of these, way back when, I would be like, oh, this is strange. Or even, this makes me a little queasy. This is kind of weird. Not sure I like this. Then it would be like, oh, this is puzzling. Maybe I should learn a little bit more. Then I would hit, this is really cool. I like this. It seems to be working, right? The example I use all the time is Wikipedia. Wikipedia is designed from trust. Say yes if you remember the first time you used Wikipedia. It's so much better. Say yes if you remember the day you realized how Wikipedia works. did you just go like, wait, what idiot designed this thing? Right? Like any fool on the planet can come change any page in the encyclopedia we're all relying on? Really? Like, who thought that was going to work? Well, Ward Cunningham thought that was going to work. And he's one of my contrarians, and he lives in Portland where I live, and he's a friend. And he invented the very first wiki, which then informed how Wikipedia actually grew up. And so once you have that, wow, this is cool, I can't believe this works experience, then maybe you want a little bit more. So my next stage of awareness was, oh, this seems like it might be important. And that would build to, wait, how does it work again? And I would get more interested and start to investigate it. And then I'd figure out, oh, wait, this fits the pattern. This might be one of my contrarians. This might be an element of the solutions that I'm looking for. So what is the pattern? What do I mean by the pattern? So a lot of these contrarians were attacked by their peers. They grew up old, crust, and crotchety. In particular, I'll point you here to Christopher Alexander, who became paranoid. And my friend Dick Gabriel made friends with Alexander and actually got galleys of a 4-volume tome called The Nature of Order. And a bunch of other, there's a few side stories there. But being an outsider in your field is not a fun thing. When you're talking about something that makes everybody else really angry at you because you're undermining their reality, or you're saying something that's too difficult for them to contemplate, can be a really lonely path. Not all the contrarians were lonely and pushed out, but a lot of them really were. The solutions that each of them offer are not full golden solutions to everything. I'm not proposing that every intersection in every city should be traffic calmed in the way that Hans would have done. But what I'm saying is that these are actually wisdom, hard-earned wisdom, and design advice for how to move forward from a basis of trust, and that's really, really important. Their solutions are often really uncomfortable, and noticing that discomfort is sometimes evidence that you're in front of one of these kinds of things. Now, again, I'm trying to get you inside my head for how I developed my particular worldview, and my particular worldview, because it's about trust, involves discomfort. Because when you switch from mistrust to trust, things go off inside of you that don't normally go off when you're just using your brain and logic prevails, which, alas, doesn't happen that often in this world. So this is where we are now on the map. I'm going to tell you, like, okay, great, so where does this take me? What are some conclusions? And I have a whole bucket of conclusions and not a lot of time to work with them. So I'm going to just talk them through lightly. And I have office hours tonight and tomorrow afternoon. So from 6 to 8 tonight in the little office in the corner over on campus, please drop by. I'll be using that brain software and entertaining any question you want to ask. Again, 2 hours tomorrow as well. So I discovered that people are more trustworthy than we think they are. I attended South by Southwest many years ago, and there was one session where Jimmy Wales, the inventor of Wikipedia, interviewed Craig Newmark, the inventor of Craigslist. During the 90 minutes, both of them, independently, unprompted, said some variant of that sentence. You know what? One of the reasons Craigslist works is that people are more trustworthy than we think they are. And I was like, awesome. So one of the things that just bubbles up right out of all of this that I'm looking at is assume good intent. The conclusion from that is, hey, start with assuming good faith or good intent on the part of the other party you're dealing with. That doesn't mean blind or naive and like good faith. It doesn't mean everybody's good. There are bad actors out there. But if you know how to defend yourself and you know what the signs of bad action are, you can then sort of step back and go into a defensive stance. But start with an assumption that most people really want to help, and you'll discover that it's mostly true. I also discovered we've normalized so many stupid, dysfunctional things, and we take them for granted. We don't even question them. And when you start to question them, people are like, nope, can't be any different. There's too many people on Earth. It won't scale. Your solution won't scale. The 3 words I've heard kill more good ideas are, it won't scale. Because what we think, I think, is engineering scale. And engineering scale is what Intel does. They have a fab line of new chips. They make a bunch of assembly lines for the chip. They tune all the parameters. They figure out which assembly line has the highest yield. And then they take all the settings on this line and they say, replicate this exactly everywhere. And that's engineering scale, because then you can make a whole lot of perfect chips. And guess what? Human systems don't work that way. Because we don't like being told exactly what to do, because lots of different reasons. So So how do you get past that and achieve scale, which means affect a whole lot of people, but through social processes? And here I think we need things like contagion. How do you get social contagion of good things to do? So to see what we've normalized that's dumb, we have to start learning how to identify the hidden architectures of mistrust. So many sensible things, like the solutions I've been describing so far, seem dangerous, counterintuitive. So why, when, and how did we lose faith in humans? And doesn't that make you a little sad? Aren't you just a wee bit saddened that we seem to not trust us? And the we and the us is like us? It's like, what do you mean we, us? I don't know. We inherited a lot of these things. These things are historic, but they're broken. And the good news here is there is so much to fix. Like really, when you start looking around and seeing through this lens, there is just so much to fix. So mistrust destroys abundance. What you get is scarcity, and many times artificial scarcity. I have a couple videos online where I talk about this equation I created called scarcity equals abundance minus trust. A scarce system often, not always, can be scarce because you started with an abundant system and then you took out the trust that preserved the abundance, and so you get scarcity. Happens all the time, all over the place. Trust also builds community because trust is about trust between people, and people start to do things together and enjoy it. So it builds community. Trust is cheaper than control. I have several videos online that step through 5 different reasons why this is true. But when you think about the cost of control, the cost of measuring, enforcing, building gates, locks, whatever else it might be when you don't trust people, control is very expensive. And trust can make those things very inexpensive. Trust, and this is my favorite one of the insights, when you don't trust people and you force them into a particular role or status or set of steps through a coercive process, you kill the genius that they showed up with. Most people are pretty damn smart. And they're sitting in situations where they're told, your job is to be a transportation analyst, and here are the parameters of what you do. You report to this person who reports to this person. Don't swim outside your lane. And in self-managing organizations, that's not what they say. So that's workplace democracy is another name for this. It's a completely different way of looking at employees and people and how people find their way to projects and work. So there's a whole bunch of genius that is present that we get rid of. We don't allow to show up in the room. Now, the status quo systems that exist today don't really like all these trust-based solutions. They think they're kooky, they reject them. There's a lot of tissue rejection going on in the world. So my question to you is, what if we trusted you? What if we started doing this? And I urge you to explore how these systems work. Now, so these insights turned into what I would call a policy platform. This is my trust. If somebody made me emperor tomorrow, I would say, let's go do these things. Let's go do open source software is fabulous. Open content I love. Community-led development, self-directed education. I've mentioned some of these sorts of things, and I don't have time to go into them. But if I were able to say what sorts of systems already exist in the world today. So every label except one on that page is a movement that exists today. And what I'm saying is blow some oxygen on these embers and let's make this the more dominant system in each of these areas. So in policing, we've militarized our police. In the US, it's terrible. We gave them all the weapons that came off of Iraq and Afghanistan. We've trained them on how to shoot to kill without asking. Really, American policing is pretty hideous right now. There's a thing called policing by consent. And the Peel principles that started the Metropolitan Police Force in London, all those things date way back. They're brilliant. Let's just reinstitute those. The thing that's not a movement yet is the last item on my list, build the big fungus. And here I just have to explain myself for a little bit. I've been feeding this brain file for 25 years. So I was on the first press tour for this little company that had a piece of mind mapping software called the brain. And the moment the inventor opens his laptop and starts demoing it, my wet brain goes, ooh, tasty. And I started using the software a month before they shipped to the public. That was 25 years ago. I'm still using it to this day. The file that I created 25 years ago is the same file I fed today. So I've been curating one mind map for 25 years. I passed 500,000 entries a couple months ago. So it's interesting, and you can go browse it for free at Jerry's Brain. And I refer to this as the big fungus, and I have to tell another little side story. because of leafcutter ants. You've probably seen nature documentaries where there's a bunch of ants carrying big pieces of leaves. Turns out that those ants can't digest leaf matter. So what are they, crazy? It turns out those ants are carrying leaf matter into their hive where they hand them off to a subgenus of that species of ant, which mulches up the leaves, and the spit and the mulch they put on a fungus. And they have a symbiotic relationship with that fungus. They feed the fungus, keep the fungus healthy, and the fungus metabolizes the leaf matter and oozes nectar and little tasty globules of fungus bits. Sound good, doesn't it? Which keeps the hive healthy and happy. And the symbiosis goes all the way down. At some point, biologists noticed that there was a white powder on the thorax of the ants that were right there at the fungus face. And so they scraped that off. It turns out it's a bacterium that is there for the health of the fungus in the hive. It's a symbiotic bacterium that's good for the fungus. So now to glue these things together, my work feeding this mind map for 25 years, I have felt like a lonely ant at the fungus face. And this is happy work. I really enjoy doing this because I feel like I'm making sense of the world. And when I click something in and it goes in the right place, I feel a little shot of dopamine. It's like when you find that puzzle piece you couldn't find and you put it on the puzzle, you're like, that's good. And unfortunately, that gets me back into the addiction to keep feeding this brain thing. But I look to the left and I look to the right and I say, where's everybody else? We should be creating a shared memory between the pattern languages and the data and the open science and everything else. We should be creating a space in which we can make sense of the world together. And that's what I'm working on these days. So in my brain, unfortunately, there's several different thoughts. Each node is called a thought. Several different thoughts where I collect up all these different initiatives and movements, but this is one of them. It's the Design from Trust platform, I call it. So I got that far, and then I had a bunch of better ideas. So I created something called Design from Trust that wants to be a methodology or a consultancy, but isn't yet. I haven't written a book about any of these things. Out of that came an idea I called the Joy Line. When I was working with an insurance company in Australia in 2016, I realized that, and this applies outside of insurance, but I'll tell it to you very quickly in insurance, almost all of insurance operates below the Joy Line, meaning I buy insurance, I pay an insurance company money I don't want to pay them for an event I hope never happens. When that event happens, I'm pretty sure they're going to find a little bit of small fine print where they don't bring me up to where I was. But if everything works perfectly, they make me whole, which means they bring me back only to my old Joy Line. And the company I was working with was a little startup called Trove, which would have known that maybe I have an expensive downhill mountain bike that I haven't used for a while. And they could then say, hey, Jerry, you haven't used it for a while. Would you like to use it again? We've discovered a couple of downhill biking groups in your neighborhood. Would you like to join them? We can hook you up. Would you like to sell your bike? We've pre-made a sales pitch for you on Craigslist or somewhere else, or Facebook Markets or whatnot. Any of those things would be above the Joy Line. And there's a bunch of other thinking around that. And then finally, another idea that spun out of all this thinking was something I call being a trusted ally. How can a company be so trustworthy that they're actually helping you make your life better? So in trying to figure out how to build your own worldview, what do I recommend you do? First, pay attention to what itches. Learn to recognize a useful itch. Do not take everything for granted. Just because something is, humans built it. Maybe a bunch of humans. It wasn't always one person with a clear blueprint and a design, but humans made the systems that we live inside of. They're changeable in different ways. Conventional wisdom is often wrong. The word innovative does not equal good. So beware of innovative. But then look for patterns. Look for what's common in things that interest you. Look very broadly. I'm unfortunately curious about absolutely everything. So as you saw from my Contrarians, they're in every field. They're in psychology, they're in education, they're all over the place. And I love that because the thesis is consistent across all the different fields. Humans have zillions of biases. Our minds are just this confusing rack of stuff that doesn't always really work well. Beware of confirmation bias, availability bias, and 100 other biases. Test your ideas with other people and think big, and then try to do big. And I think I've done a good job of think big. I don't think I've done a very good job of do big, and I'm working on that. So I'm very happy to have realized back in 1993 that the word consumer mattered to me. This is the entry for consumer in Raymond Williams' book, Keywords, which I highly recommend. Williams basically does a study of the history of a bunch of words like capitalism and socialism and consumer, and says, how did they change in nature and what happened to them? And I'm really happy that when this word came up, I noticed it. I mentioned it to my boss at the time, Esther Dyson, and she said, oh, don't worry about it. It's just a term of art in the ad business. And my little inner voice said, ooh, no, it's not. It's like a part of the problem that we face. And doing that and sticking with it for 30 years is what got me to where I am today with all the things I've just tried to show you. So this is the last page of the deck. These are the resources that you can go find. If you go find the deck, I'd love to turn up the house lights and do a couple minutes of Q&A because I've eaten almost all our time, but we might have a chance for 1 or 2 questions. And thank you very much.
Amazing presentation, like really, really innovative, I would say.
Thank you.
So what's your advice on, like, what's the first step? How should we start?
So there's several first steps. One of them is just watch your use of the word consumer and see if you can purge it from your vocabulary and substitute it for person, customer, citizen, member, participant. There's a bunch of other good words. Another thing is start paying attention to what's troubling to you in the world. Talk to a 5-year-old. Like, 5-year-olds are just damn smart, and they ask the craziest common sense questions. And they're like, why are there poor people sleeping on the side of the road? It's like, well, because that's what happens to people. And they're like, meh. Really, no. And in the US, we have this as a very big problem. Other countries with more advanced systems don't have as bad a problem. But pay attention to sort of those things. And then one of my beliefs is that we need to hear a lot of stories. Like, we need to hear stories of what worked in other places and what happened. Use my brain as a resource or ping me and I'll send you towards stories. But if you absorb stories of what people have done successfully, then you'll begin thinking, oh, okay, I could adapt some of what they did to my situation over here. So something like that. Another question? Over here in the front row?
Where?
Right here? Perfect.
Hello. Thank you for the insightful presentation. How do you think we got to do things so flawed? How do you think we got to have this way of doing things that is not efficient?
How did things break so badly? How did we lose faith in humans?
Yes, and probably I'm thinking it's because of the human nature. Probably.
I don't think so. So that's not my answer, actually.
Okay.
I think humans are very imperfect, and we have all these, biases and everything else. But I don't think it's because humans are necessarily bad. One of my beliefs, and you'll see in my brain at the top it says my beliefs. One of my beliefs is that people are born good and connected to the earth, and then we socialize that out of them. We tell babies, no, this is reality, not the aura you see around the tree. That's not real. So people who see auras later in life preserve the skill sort of early in their life. So I don't think it's human nature. I think what happens is my amateur theory of history is that history is a fight over the joystick in the cockpit of each country or nation or place. And there's parties that make up stories for the world works like this and we should be doing this over here. And the other person's like, no, it's not like this. And sometimes they crash the plane into the ground. And very often somebody wins and their story is bogus. Their story isn't bogus, but then they go and design every institution around that story. And so one of my other amateur theories of history is, and I'm borrowing yin and yang from Taoism here briefly, I'm going to tear it up a little bit. I'm actually going to amplify it. So in yin and yang, yang is active, male, bright, outward energy, and yin is receptive, earth, dark, feminine energy. It's not that all men are yang and all women are yin. It's that each entity, whether it's a person, a family, or a culture, needs to have yin and yang in tension, in creative tension, and the interesting stuff happens at the interface between yin and yang. My amateur theory of history is we've been suffering from a yang overdose for somewhere between 300 to 3,000 years. Industrial Revolution to linear writing. Somewhere in that window, for a variety of reasons, yang won. And yang decided to pursue a scorched earth strategy and to get rid of yin and tell everybody, yin is terrible. You should not look at that stuff. All systems need to be built logically. We need Aristotelian logic. as the platform for humanity and civilization. Forget those indigenous people who figured shit out. Like, let's build stuff online. And I'm telling you, that doesn't work. Because it doesn't fit how humans work. And this is, again, I'm an amateur on all this stuff, but that's where I got to. It's like, and we're at a moment right now where indigenous wisdom is actually sort of getting a seat at the table, and people are interested in how do we blend science with indigenous ways of knowing, and that's awesome. And a lot of indigenous cultures see things that we rational people don't even see and won't entertain seeing that are pretty real.
And you said it yourself that you're happy with the theoretical part of your understanding, but not so happy with the practical one.
Yeah.
Why do you think it's such difficult? Why is it such a struggle if the things are so clear to make them happen?
So part of it is me. I have been the COE of my own little company, my one-person company, since 1998. The COE is Chief and Only Employee. And I am a terrible boss. I am just a really bad boss. So I'm not a slave driver. I'm curious as hell. I have shiny object syndrome. What I like to say is squirrel, right? If you watch the movie Up, I think. And so I'm very distractible, and I'm interested in everything, which got me to this thesis, right? Wandering around and chasing and trying a whole lot of things, being a bumblebee from field to field, got me here, but didn't get me to write a single book, which I need to do, et cetera, et cetera. And then I know a lot of people doing these movements, but my little movements are slow going and they're more like salons than movements. But I do have communities. Join Open Global Mind. Go find openglobalmind.com. There's some instructions there to join in the conversations. We have all kinds of cool things going on every week on Zoom, unfortunately, but stuff like that. Is there time for one more question? There's not. I can see Diana going, nope, not really. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Jerry. Stay a little bit here, please.
Let me unplug this while you talk.
Yeah, we do hope we see you again in Romania. But before we end this, we have few practical considerations. One, which is not a very good news necessarily, but I did check, and Christopher Alexander indeed died.
He did die?
Yes.
Thank you for checking.
A few months
ago. Sort of sad,
though. And then two other aspects that are very important. The slides, as Jerry was mentioning, you can find them on Jerry Michalski /now, correct?
NOW, yep.
Yeah. And then you can always go by his office between 6 and 8 p.m., and he still has office hours today and tomorrow. So if there are any other questions left after these sessions, I think that will be a very good opportunity to talk more with him. Yeah?
Cool.
Thank you very much, Jerry,
Thank you.
again. Thank you.